Have you ever heard of the Forgotten War? It's a conflict that reshaped the world, drew lines on the map that still exist today, and cost millions of lives. Yet, for many, it remains a shadow in the history books, overshadowed by the wars that came before and after. Today, we're pulling back that shadow. We're going deep into the story of the Korean War. To understand how it started, we have to rewind to the end of World War II. For decades, Korea had been under Japanese rule. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Allied powers needed a plan. The solution they landed on was to temporarily divide Korea at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union would oversee the North, and the United States would oversee the South, with the promise of reunifying the country after free elections. But the Cold War was brewing. The ideological chasm between the Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States was deepening. This temporary division began to look more and more permanent. In the North, the Soviets supported a communist government led by Kim Il-sung. In the South, the Americans backed a pro-Western government led by Syngman Rhee. Both leaders were fiercely nationalistic and dreamed of a unified Korea, but under their own rule. The promised elections never happened. Instead, two separate states emerged: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, in the north, and the Republic of Korea, ROK, in the south. Tensions along the 38th parallel were sky-high, with frequent border skirmishes. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came at dawn on June 25, 1950. With the backing of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, nearly 100,000 North Korean soldiers stormed across the 38th parallel. They were well equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, and they quickly overwhelmed the less prepared South Korean army. The invasion was a massive shock to the international community. The United States, fearing the domino effect, the idea that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow, saw this not just as an attack on South Korea, but as a direct challenge to the non-communist world. President Harry S. Truman acted swiftly. He bypassed a congressional declaration of war and instead went to the newly formed United Nations. In a strategic move, because the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council at the time, the UN passed a resolution condemning the invasion and calling on member states to assist South Korea. This led to the formation of a UN command, with the United States providing the vast majority of troops and resources. 16 other countries would also send forces, making it a truly international coalition. The first few months of the war were disastrous for the UN and South Korean forces. The North Korean People's Army, or KPA, pushed them relentlessly southward. Within 3 days, Seoul, the South Korean capital, had fallen. By August, the UN and ROK forces were cornered in a tiny pocket of land in the southeastern corner of the peninsula, an area that became known as the Pusan Perimeter. It seemed like the entire country was on the brink of falling. The fighting inside the perimeter was desperate and brutal, but they held on. Then, General Douglas MacArthur, the celebrated World War II hero and commander of the UN forces, proposed a brilliant but incredibly risky plan: an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. Many in the Pentagon thought it was insane. The tides at Incheon were treacherous, the seawalls were high, and the harbor was easily defended. But MacArthur was convinced it was the key to victory. On September 15, 1950, the landing at Incheon went ahead. It was a stunning success. The Marines stormed ashore, catching the North Koreans completely by surprise. With their supply lines cut, the North Korean army in the south began to collapse. At the same time, the forces trapped in the Pusan perimeter broke out. The tide of the war had dramatically turned. UN forces recaptured Seoul and pushed northward, crossing the 38th parallel in early October with a new objective: not just to save South Korea, but to reunify the entire peninsula under a non-communist government. As UN troops advanced deep into North Korea, getting closer and closer to the Yalu River, which marks the border with China, a new, powerful player entered the game. China's leader, Mao Zedong, had repeatedly warned the U.S. not to approach his border. He feared an American-backed, unified Korea as a direct threat. When those warnings were ignored, Mao made a fateful decision. In late October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's volunteers began secretly crossing the Yalu River into North Korea. The first clashes were a shock to the overconfident UN forces, who were unprepared for the sheer number of Chinese soldiers and their tactics of nighttime assaults and ambushes. On a frigid November night, the Chinese launched a massive, full-scale offensive. UN troops, scattered and thinly spread, were sent into a frantic retreat. The fighting during this withdrawal was some of the most harrowing of the war, especially for the U.S. Marines at the Chosin Reservoir, who fought their way out of an encirclement in brutally cold weather, an engagement that has become legendary in military history. The war had now entered a brutal new phase. The Chinese and North Korean forces pushed the UN troops back down the peninsula, recapturing Seoul once again in January 1951. The front line stabilized roughly around the original 38th parallel, and the War of Rapid Movement devolved into a grinding war of attrition, reminiscent of the trench warfare of World War I. For the next 2 years, battles were fought for control of strategic hills with names that became infamous: Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, Bloody Ridge. Gains were measured in yards, and the cost in human lives was immense. During this stalemate, another conflict was brewing, this one between President Truman and General MacArthur. MacArthur wanted to escalate the war. He publicly advocated for a naval blockade of China, bombing Chinese industrial centers, and even using nuclear weapons. He was openly critical of Truman's policy of a limited war, which aimed to contain the conflict to the Korean peninsula. This insubordination was too much for Truman. In a move that shocked the American public, he fired the popular general in April 1951, stating that "we are trying to prevent a world war, not to start one." Meanwhile, peace talks had begun in July 1951, but they dragged on for 2 excruciating years. The main sticking point was the issue of prisoners of war. Many Chinese and North Korean prisoners held by the UN did not want to be repatriated to their communist homelands. The communists insisted on forced repatriation for all. The UN, led by the US, stood firm on the principle of voluntary repatriation. While the diplomats argued, the soldiers on the front lines continued to fight and die. Finally, a few key events broke the deadlock. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 brought a change in Soviet policy, and the new U.S. President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, hinted that he might be willing to use nuclear weapons if the stalemate continued. Under this increased pressure, the communists finally compromised on the POW issue. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. It was not a peace treaty, it was merely a ceasefire. The agreement established the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, a heavily fortified buffer zone near the 38th parallel that serves as the border between North and South Korea to this day. The war was over, but the peninsula remained divided and technically still at war. The human cost was staggering. Estimates vary, but it's believed that up to 3 million people died, the majority of them Korean civilians. The war left both North and South Korea in ruins, their cities and infrastructure completely destroyed. For the United States, it was the first major military conflict of the Cold War, and it set the stage for future interventions. Today, South Korea has transformed into a vibrant, democratic, and economic powerhouse. North Korea remains one of the most isolated and repressive regimes in the world. The DMZ is a stark, daily reminder of this forgotten war, a conflict that ended in a stalemate but whose consequences continue to shape our world. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Korean War. If you found this history as important and compelling as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. See you next time.